When historians describe the year 1844 across the eastern seaboard, they usually focus on the communication revolution above ground. Samuel Morse's first telegraphic message transmitted from Washington to Baltimore. The rapid expansion of telegraph wire strung between cities, the transformation of long-distance communication from weeks-long mail delivery to near-instantaneous electrical transmission, and the 40 telegraph companies competing to wire the nation for the new technology. But the real story, the one that barely appeared in technical journals, the one that even today stands visible in forgotten stone towers across the countryside, began decades before Morse's famous demonstration. It started with a straightforward telegraph line survey project. Engineering teams were instructed to identify optimal routes for new telegraph wire installations across New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. The goal was practical: map terrain, locate existing structures for pole placement, and determine whether proposed routes could support the infrastructure demands of electrical telegraphy. But the moment survey crews began documenting existing towers and hilltop structures, something unexpected happened. They discovered communication networks that predated electrical telegraph by nearly a century. Throughout the surveyed regions, on hilltops and elevated positions, the crews found stone towers and signal stations that showed clear evidence of systematic message transmission. Their positioning was too precise, their sightline connections were undeniable, and the technology didn't resemble anything in the electrical telegraph equipment catalogues. It didn't even resemble European semaphore systems as commonly understood. This wasn't mentioned in the public reports about telegraph expansion. It didn't make it into the newspapers celebrating Morse's invention. But in the internal notes of that year, a quiet phrase appears over and over again. Pre-existing signal towers. Atmospheric transmission capability. Origin predates known systems. The official story would later simplify all of this into old military watchtowers, colonial-era beacon stations, or simply decorative estate architecture. Nothing unusual, nothing worth discussion. But the survey photographs from the time, the ones developed in telegraph company offices, while America rushed to install wire networks, show something different. They show engineers examining towers with internal chambers designed for signal amplification. Stone structures positioned in precise geometric networks with intervisibility across dozens of miles. Architectural features that don't resemble defensive fortifications, but something more sophisticated. Atmospheric resonance chambers, crystalline panel arrays, and metallic framework that suggested the towers weren't just relay points for visual signals, but active transmission stations for some form of wireless communication. And the deeper they surveyed, the more the towers stopped looking like primitive signal fires as we know them, and more like components of a sophisticated communication network that had been operating across the colonies for decades before the Revolution, requiring no wires, no electricity, and somehow transmitting information through principles that official telegraph science insisted were impossible without electrical current. At first, the survey teams tried to categorize everything in the simplest way possible. Old military installations from French and Indian War, colonial beacon networks for emergency warnings, navigational aids for maritime traffic. But as documentation accumulated and more towers were mapped, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why were some of the towers built with internal resonance chambers that had no military or navigational purpose? Why were certain structures positioned in networks that maintained exact angular relationships as if designed to create focused transmission corridors rather than simple line-of-sight beacon chains? Why did some towers contain apparatus, crystalline panels, metallic mesh assemblies, geometric focusing elements that showed no connection to any known visual signaling method? And the question that troubled even the most experienced telegraph engineers: why were these towers so systematically networked? Early visual telegraph systems required operators at each station manually passing messages in sequence. Yet the tower networks showed architectural features suggesting automated signal relay, atmospheric amplification, and transmission ranges that exceeded anything visual signaling could achieve. Survey teams quietly admitted among themselves that the tower positioning and sophistication didn't line up with any known colonial communication system. And although none of them were using terms like atmospheric telegraphy, they were acknowledging something just as unsettling. Someone had built a wireless communication network across the colonies before electrical science officially existed. Not simple beacon fires, not primitive semaphore, systematic long-distance message transmission. If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider subscribing. These mysteries don't fit neatly into official history, and uncovering them requires looking where conventional narratives refuse to go. As the documentation increased, so did the suppression. Telegraph companies accelerated tower demolition schedules. Engineers who documented the sophisticated pre-electrical networks found their survey reports edited or rejected. Historical societies were discouraged from preserving towers along proposed telegraph routes, and then the most sophisticated structures were systematically demolished during telegraph construction in 1845 and 1846, destroyed where needed for wire clearance. And much of what was documented was removed from maps before independent researchers could conduct proper analysis. Only fragments remain, survey notes, with portions missing, a handful of photographs in telegraph company archives, and the quiet testimonies of engineers who examined complete tower networks before corporate ordered demolition. But even from what survives, a pattern becomes visible. Communication technology too advanced for pre-electrical era. Network sophistication too high for the accepted timeline. Transmission principles that look mastered rather than discovered. And most remarkably, dozens of the original towers still standing today, repurposed as observation decks, water towers, or historic landmarks, but retaining their original atmospheric chambers and transmission architecture, sealed and forgotten inside weathered stone walls. When the survey teams moved beyond the first recognizable military watchtowers in coastal regions, the expectations were simple. They believed they would find defensive positions, perhaps some colonial-era lighthouses, and scattered remnants of frontier warning systems. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. But within months, that assumption collapsed because instead of a random distribution of historical structures, the teams uncovered as a precisely engineered communication network that didn't behave the way primitive signal systems are supposed to behave. The first anomaly was geometric precision. In tower networks throughout the surveyed regions, engineers found structures positioned with mathematical exactitude, not approximately aligned, not roughly spaced, precisely positioned at specific intervals, creating triangulation networks that maintained exact angular relationships across hundreds of miles. Different construction periods shouldn't do that. Different builders, different purposes, different colonial authorities. They don't build in perfect geometric harmony across territories controlled by separate colonies. Yet, throughout the eastern seaboard, they did. Towers in New York's Hudson Valley aligned exactly with towers discovered in Pennsylvania's Allegheny. Ridges. Structures in Virginia's Shenandoah maintained the same geometric relationships, even when separated by vast distances and supposedly built by different colonial governments. It was as if every tower was positioned according to an original master plan, one that no longer existed in any colonial archive. As the workers surveyed deeper into the tower internals, the architecture became stranger. Beyond the expected defensive features and beacon platforms, they began encountering installations that looked nothing like military or navigational equipment. Internal chambers with parabolic acoustics, metallic mesh assemblies, too complex to be simple lighting fixtures, crystalline panel arrays, too precisely shaped to be decorative elements, and atmospheric resonance features too mathematically exact for anything in the documented colonial timeline. Some towers appeared almost over-engineered. Perfect hemispherical chambers with acoustic focusing properties, crafted with precision that didn't match the crude masonry attributed to colonial construction. The materials themselves raised questions. Metallurgical analysis conducted years later on salvaged components showed unusual alloy compositions, metals with piezoelectric properties, crystalline structures with specific resonance frequencies, and surface treatments that resembled modern transducer materials more than 18th century metalwork. And then came the discovery that puzzled even the most conservative members of the engineering community. Documented long-distance communication. Not speculation, not legend. Actual colonial records describing message transmission between towers separated by 40, 50, even 60 miles, occurring in minutes rather than the hours or days that horseback relay would require. Records describing communication maintained during fog and darkness when visual signalling was impossible. Accounts of messages transmitted simultaneously to multiple destinations, network broadcasting that shouldn't be achievable with any known pre-electrical system. Yet colonial administrative records, merchant shipping logs, and military dispatches clearly documented a communication network operating throughout the 1750s, 1780s that achieved transmission speeds and reliability that visual semaphore cannot explain. No records showing the massive relay stations and personnel that visual systems require. Nothing that explains how messages traversed terrain where line of sight didn't exist. Nothing except the towers themselves and their sophisticated atmospheric transmission apparatus. Survey photographs taken in 1844 and 1845 show this clearly. Engineers standing beside tower chambers with metallic mesh assemblies designed for electromagnetic field interaction. Crystalline panels arranged in patterns that modern radio engineering recognizes as optimal for signal focusing. Internal geometries that create standing wave resonance at frequencies capable of propagating through atmospheric waveguides. But the most unsettling detail was not what appeared in the photographs. It was what happened to colonial communication records themselves. Administrative documents from the 1750s, 1780s frequently referenced tower signals, atmospheric dispatch, and resonant transmission between colonial cities. But compilations of colonial history, published after 1850, systematically reinterpret these references as simple beacon fires or horseback messengers, despite the original documents clearly describing something more sophisticated. The silence is hard to miss. Because if these communication towers truly represented only primitive visual signalling, why weren't they simply documented as interesting historical precursors to telegraph? Why the urgent removal of structures along telegraph routes? Why were functioning communication networks forcibly dismantled when they posed no obstacle to wire installation? Even the architectural evidence raised red flags. Internal chambers with perfect acoustic. Properties serving no defensive purpose. Metallic assemblies positioned for electromagnetic interaction. Not visual display. Crystalline components designed for piezoelectric resonance, not decoration. Features that looked less like colonial era construction and more like mature wireless technology. Technology that, according to the conventional timeline, didn't exist until radio was developed in the 1890s. Yet here it was, fully implemented and operating in the 1750s. The deeper the team surveyed, the harder it became to fit these findings into the accepted narrative of communication technology development. Because tower by tower, network by network, the colonial landscape began to look less like a progression toward telegraph and more like a systematic replacement of superior wireless technology with inferior wired systems. A transition that made no technical sense but perfect economic sense if someone wanted to ensure long-distance communication became dependent on wire networks that telegraph companies controlled. When the survey teams pushed deeper into their documentation of the pre-electrical tower networks, the discoveries stopped resembling anything that belonged to conventional colonial construction. What they began uncovering were not just signal stations, but complete atmospheric communication systems operating on principles that mainstream physics wouldn't acknowledge until the wireless revolution of the 1890s. Technology that didn't match known colonial capabilities, didn't match any documented systems, and somehow achieved performance that early electrical telegraph struggled to replicate. The first shock came with the network architecture itself. These weren't isolated towers or simple beacon chains. They were an organized communication grid, a complete long-distance network with what appeared to be primary transmission stations, secondary relay points, and terminal receiving stations laid out in a coherent geometric pattern. Some towers were positioned at precise intervals, forming triangulation networks. Others contained what appeared to be signal amplification systems, installations designed to receive, amplify, and retransmit signals without human intervention. The layout wasn't random or organic. It was planned, designed, executed with the kind of systematic engineering that modern telecommunications networks use for optimal signal coverage. And then came the feature that still puzzles researchers today: the atmospheric resonance chambers. Officially, they were later labelled as cisterns, storage vaults, or simply unusual architectural features, but nothing about them fits conventional building purposes. These were too precisely shaped, too carefully positioned, and too obviously tuned to specific acoustic frequencies, as if they were designed to resonate with atmospheric pressure waves, what modern physics recognizes as extremely low frequency, ELF, electromagnetic propagation through the Earth ionosphere cavity. Some chambers were large enough to occupy entire lower floors of towers. Others contained internal structures that appeared designed for standing wave formation. Survey crews from the 1844 documentation described them in private correspondence as atmospheric organs, not storage spaces, but resonance systems designed to interact with natural frequencies that propagate through the atmosphere itself, though no official history acknowledges such sophisticated understanding existing in colonial times. Another anomaly appeared in the signalling apparatus. Throughout the tower networks, engineers found what appeared to be transduction systems, devices designed to convert one form of energy into another. Not simple visual displays, but sophisticated assemblies combining crystalline elements, metallic frameworks, and geometric configurations that modern engineers recognize as primitive but functional electromagnetic transducers. Many were positioned in the resonance chambers themselves, designed to interact with atmospheric pressure oscillations and convert them into mechanical or electrical signals. They were crafted with surprising sophistication. Crystalline panels oriented at specific angles, metallic mesh forming geometric patterns that create standing wave interference, ceramic insulators positioning conductive elements with precision that suggests understanding of field theory. It created an uncomfortable possibility. The colonial towers may not have been limited to visual line-of-sight communication. They may have achieved actual wireless transmission using atmospheric resonance, a communication network whose sophistication was never properly recorded, never officially acknowledged, and never explained in American telecommunications history. The deeper the engineers investigated, the more impossible it became to dismiss these findings as architectural curiosities. What emerged was evidence of systematic atmospheric engineering, a complete wireless communication network that extended through at least 180 documented towers across 7 colonial territories, possibly more. Here's where the story gets truly bizarre. In the months following the initial tower surveys, documentation teams catalogued over 4,400 distinct signal transmission events recorded in colonial administrative documents between 1755 and 1785, not counting simple beacon fires or horseback dispatches. 4,400 documented instances of messages transmitted between towers at speeds and distances that visual semaphore cannot explain. That number appeared in preliminary telegraph company reports analysing existing communication infrastructure. but within a year it vanished from all official telecommunications history. Published histories of American communication showed no mention of the sophisticated pre-electrical network. The specific count of 4,400 impossible transmissions disappeared, almost as if someone decided that number raised too many uncomfortable questions. Because if the American colonies truly had 4,400 documented wireless communications, before electrical science officially existed, how did they achieve it? What principles were they using? And most importantly, why does the history of telecommunications pretend this network never operated? As documentation accumulated, another pattern emerged, one that researchers found profoundly disturbing. Despite being found in territories controlled by different colonial governments, built over a 40-year period, supposedly by different architects, all the tower networks shared certain characteristics: standard resonance chamber dimensions, consistent transmission apparatus designs, uniform geometric positioning. It suggested not just collaboration, but centralized planning across colonies that were officially independent and often competing. This wasn't organic colonial development. It was coordinated, possibly by a single technical authority with the resources to enforce engineering standards across multiple territories and decades of construction. The physical evidence from partially demolished towers only deepened the mystery. Survey teams found manufactured components that didn't match any known colonial craftsmen. Crystalline elements with optical properties, suggesting artificial growth rather than mining. Metallic frameworks using alloy compositions, too sophisticated for colonial metallurgy. Ceramic insulators with dielectric properties that regional pottery shouldn't achieve. Assembly techniques that implied understanding of electromagnetic principles attributed to scientists working a century later. Some towers appeared deliberately designed to conceal their true function. Atmospheric chambers hidden beneath conventional architecture, transmission apparatus disguised as decorative elements, geometric positioning rationalized as aesthetic choices. Others seemed intended for operation by technicians with specialized knowledge, access to resonance chambers requiring specific knowledge, diagnostic features for measuring atmospheric conditions, modular components designed for adjustment and maintenance by those who understood the underlying physics. Perhaps most disturbing were the operational records themselves. Colonial documents don't just mention the towers, they describe their use in routine administrative communication. Governors' correspondence references tower dispatch as a normal alternative to written messages. Military records show coordination of troop movements using atmospheric signal between commanders separated by vast distances. Merchant records document shipping schedules coordinated through resonant transmission that allowed Boston merchants to communicate with Philadelphia counterparts within the same business day. These weren't legends or exaggerations. They were routine bureaucratic records, treating wireless communication as mundane infrastructure. Until suddenly, after the 1790s, such references cease. The towers remained, but records stopped describing their sophisticated use, as if the knowledge of how to operate them was deliberately lost or suppressed. When you study the final months of the 1844 Tower Survey, something becomes impossible to ignore. The documentation didn't conclude with historical preservation or technical analysis. It concluded with demolition schedules. Not optional removal, not gradual replacement, mandatory immediate destruction along telegraph routes. The deeper the survey crews documented the pre-electrical communication technology, the more aggressive the demolition timeline became. Early reports that mentioned remarkable colonial engineering were followed by revised reports emphasizing obsolete structures blocking progress. Towers that initially merited historical study were later required for immediate removal. And this is where the final mystery begins. Because the most sophisticated towers, the most extensively networked installations, the most obviously functional. Communication systems. These were the structures where demolition was enforced first and most thoroughly. Telegraph company officials who showed interest in studying the technology found their curiosity discouraged by corporate management. Engineers who suggested preserving towers for research were reassigned to other projects. In several documented cases, entire tower networks were demolished overnight, literally with work crews operating after dark, as if someone wanted the destruction completed before the technology could be properly documented. The official explanation: telegraph wire clearance, land access requirements, modernization progress. But if it was only about installing wire, why were towers miles from any proposed telegraph route also demolished? Why were structures that posed no obstacle to wire installation forcibly removed? Why was functional communication infrastructure destroyed when it could have been studied to improve telegraph technology? It doesn't make sense from an engineering perspective. But it makes perfect sense from an economic one. If telegraph companies wanted to ensure no alternative communication method could challenge their wire monopoly. Perhaps most telling is what happened to the towers that survived. Unlike the transmission apparatus that was destroyed, many tower structures themselves remained, too costly to completely demolish, too solid to easily remove. This created a remarkable situation. Dozens, possibly hundreds, of the original towers still stand across the eastern states today. They're often repurposed as historic landmarks, observation platforms, or private residences. But the structures themselves, their geometric positioning, their internal resonance chambers, their atmospheric transmission apparatus housings, remain intact, sealed, forgotten. If you know what to look for, you can identify them. Stone towers from the 1740s, 1780s, with unusually thick walls, thicker than needed for defence because they housed the resonance chambers. Architectural features that seem excessively elaborate, actually functional components of the atmospheric collection system. Internal chambers with parabolic geometry that guides attribute to water storage, but which have acoustic properties perfectly tuned to specific resonance frequencies. Underground vaults that historians assume were for supplies, but which connect to the resonance chambers in ways that only make sense for signal amplification. The towers stand as physical evidence, often marked with historic plaques describing them as colonial watchtowers or early lighthouses, of a communication technology that official history claims was impossible before electrical telegraph. Preservationists protect them as architectural heritage. Local historical societies maintain them as tourist attractions. But no one questions why they have sophisticated internal chambers. No one examines the geometric precision of their positioning. No one analyzes the unusual materials in their atmospheric apparatus. Even colonial records tell the story, or rather, their editing does. Original administrative documents from the 1750s, 1780s clearly describe sophisticated long-distance communication. But when these documents were compiled into published colonial histories in the 1850s, 1880s, the descriptions were systematically reinterpreted. Tower signal became beacon fire. Atmospheric dispatch became messenger on horseback. Resonant transmission became visual semaphore. The sophisticated terminology was translated into primitive methods, as if editors couldn't acknowledge what the original documents plainly described. Patent records show similar suppression. Applications for atmospheric telegraph systems didn't just get rejected, they were classified. Several inventors in the 1840s, 1850s filed applications describing communication methods using atmospheric resonance, crystalline transducers, and tower-based networks. These applications were transferred to National Security Review and never returned to public filing. Inventors who inquired about their application's status received vague responses about conflicting prior art. But the prior art was never specified, because acknowledging it would mean admitting the colonial tower network existed. Several of these inventors died under circumstances their families found suspicious. One in a tower accident, during research, another in a laboratory fire that destroyed his equipment and notes, a third, who simply disappeared while surveying colonial tower sites. Others accepted payments from telegraph companies and stopped their atmospheric communication research. A few who persisted found their other inventions mysteriously denied patent protection, their professional reputations attacked in technical journals. The campaign to suppress atmospheric communication technology wasn't subtle. It was comprehensive, coordinated, and ruthlessly effective. And it succeeded so completely that most people today don't know wireless communication predated electrical telegraph, let alone that it was successfully implemented across the colonies for decades. Even the timeline tells the story. The colonial tower network operated most actively from the 1750s through the 1780s. After the Revolution, references to sophisticated tower communication gradually ceased. By the 1820s, towers were still standing, but described only as historical structures. Then, in the 1840s, exactly when electrical telegraph began expanding, the towers along major communication routes were systematically demolished. The pattern is unmistakable. A superior wireless technology was deliberately suppressed to make room for an inferior wired system that required permanent infrastructure investment controlled by private companies. Why was the most extensive evidence, the most sophisticated technology, the most economically liberating innovation suppressed and destroyed? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The atmospheric resonance chambers were destroyed. The crystalline transduction apparatus was destroyed. The 4,400 documented transmissions were removed from history. The geometric tower networks were demolished. The colonial operational records were reinterpreted. The patent applications were classified. And even the inventors' careers were destroyed, almost as if the Tower Survey had accidentally revealed a chapter of communication technology that wasn't supposed to be acknowledged. A chapter that threatened telegraph company profits. A chapter that suggested wireless communication was achievable with 18th century technology. A chapter that showed free long-distance communication was not only possible, but had been successfully operating across the colonies for generations. The 1844 tower demolitions weren't just telegraph infrastructure clearance. They were targeted elimination of technology that threatened to keep communication free from wire, dependency forever. Because if atmospheric telegraphy worked, and the colonial records prove it did, then everything that came after, the entire edifice of wired communication monopolies, was an economically motivated regression disguised as progress. And the towers still stand, on hilltops across New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and beyond. Repurposed as historic sites, their original purpose obscured by sanitized histories, their sophisticated internal mechanisms sealed and ignored. Physical evidence that they transmitted messages without wires in the 1700s. Not through impossible physics, but through atmospheric resonance principles that challenged no natural laws, only economic ones. The systems worked, the towers remain, and we've been dependent on wired and later licensed wireless communication ever since. Not because atmospheric communication was impossible, but because someone decided it was too dangerous to allow. Dangerous to profits, dangerous to control, dangerous to the monopolies that would dominate telecommunications for the next 2 centuries. Thanks for watching, and if you found this interesting, well, there are a lot more suppressed technologies with stories like this. Maybe I'll see you in the next one.